Okay, so we are moving our way now into chapter 5. So this continues on with the topic and ideas of culture, but now we're bringing specifically looking at language. And, one question that kind of pops up in the world, excuse me, one of the big questions that kind of pops up in the world is why are there so many languages? And how do they come from? Where do they come from? Why are there so many languages that are similar? Where do dialects come from? Things like that. How does this connect back to culture? How's this a representation of how we use land? It's all a big part of those things we've been kind of talking about. And, we bring this back to diffusion and distribution. We're going to connect it to religion and ethnicity and race and political geography. So a lot of this is really all connected and why it fits very well with the topic of culture. So right here we have the Tower of Babel, or at least a representation of the Tower of Babel, told through the Bible. And for those of you that know the Bible, you know that the Tower of Babel, mentioned in the first parts of the book Genesis, talks about how humans are trying to come together to reach the heavens and God, and working together to do so by building the largest structure, essentially, as the Bible writes it, ever created. And in order for mankind to not be so close and to keep them, mortal and not divine, God strikes down the tower. And then essentially to ensure that mankind can never really come together again in the way that they had with the Tower of Babel, essentially in God's perspective, challenge God, was to divide the world into different languages by sending the message to these different peoples, and then that's the biblical reason or the biblical story for why language is what it is, which I think is really, really unique to kind of describe it that way. So, so we're gonna look at a lot of different stuff here. So our definition of language is a system of communication through speech using a collection of sounds that a group of people understand have the same meaning. Essentially, the fact that you're watching this video and you can understand what I'm saying means that we have that system of communication through the various sounds that I'm creating that you can understand, as opposed to blah, 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 and not having any meaning behind that. Because if I was to go blah, 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 and say that this meant all the things that I just mentioned right here, you don't have that sound of communication. Just like in the same sense that, animals, when, they're barking, or, dogs when they're barking, cats when they're meowing, like they have different sounds to convey different meanings, not necessarily, obviously whole sentences and thoughts, but they can sort of communicate with each other that what's going on, what they need, what their wants are a little bit. And so it's really interesting and kind of, if you go to linguistical studies, this is kind of what you do is you study language, and I think it's just so unique to do, because there's an article that we've done from time to time in the past called "What Does a Tiger Mean?" And I pose that question, and when we're in class, I'll pose it then too. And it usually just kind of, what does a tiger mean? Well, what does it mean? It means nothing. It means essentially a big cat, but it can mean anything depending on what language you're using. That how we in English use the word tiger to describe a big cat with stripes that is orange for the most part. It could mean snow in another language. It could define itself as, a type of food. Like it can be anything, but we've agreed through cultural understandings over time, we've developed the word tiger to mean big yellow cat with stripes. Which again, it's just a really unique take on that. And so we can tie that in here with literary tradition, is that a literary tradition is just a system of written language. So it puts the spoken words to paper. And for many languages over time, they did not necessarily have that literary tradition. They had a language system to kind of, communicate with one another, and then they used oral histories to kind of pass down traditions, pass down stories from one generation to the next, or they had some other kinds of meaning, like the quipus with the Incas, using, knotted strings to convey histories and stories while things weren't necessarily written down on paper. So I think, having a literary tradition helps to support a language as long as people can understand what it is that is written. So yeah, you can't have literary tradition without a language that people can know and understand. All right. So how we talk about the organization of the world's languages. So the way that geographers and linguists do is they organize it like a tree, which we'll show here in a second, known as a language family tree. And so essentially, the language family is a collection of languages that are related through some sort of ancestral language, but there's no one spot that we can say, when we know a time or a place or a person created a language. We know that they all come together, and we have theories as to how these languages kind of are connected. Like we can see connections in the words, in the meanings, in the speech patterns that would say, yeah, these are connected languages, but we can't necessarily say where they came from or how they came to be, just that there are very strong similarities that we can see, and we can see diverging points over time. And so that's the family, the overarching thing. And again, when you see the visual, it makes sense. After that, it's a branch, so the connection of languages that have that common ancestral language. And then you have a language group, which is a collection of languages within a branch that have similarities in both grammar and vocab. They have similar words, similar language structures, things like that. And then the language itself is the leaves. So when we look at, here is our big language family trees. So all of these different language families. So Indo-European, Japanese is kind of its own thing, Afro-Asiatic, Altaic, and you can kind of see how they break up. And so like Indo-European breaks up into Germanic, Romance, Baltic Slavic, Indo-Iranian, and then you can see all of the different types of languages that break up over time, and the leaves themselves are the trees. And the bigger the leaves means that there are more speakers on the planet. So, you know, English being really big here, Arabic, Russian, Hindi. And you're like, hey, wait a minute, where's Mandarin, the biggest language on the planet? That's a different tree over here that we're going to see in a sec. So the language family itself is the big tree right here. Okay, the branch, an example here is Germanic. All right, the language group, or a language group, would be West Germanic, because it does split off between North Germanic, which is like Danish, or Norwegian, and Swedish, while West Germanic has, you know, Dutch, English, and German, and Afrikaans, which is in South America, and then the actual language itself, which are the leaves. And then over here you can see the Sino-Tibetan, which breaks off with Mandarin. And so, you know, a lot of these have some sort of possible, that's why they say it's possible prehistoric superfamilies with Nostralic, but there's no necessarily one cause or belief with that. So where are they located? So again, the book has very similar things within that. You know, what accounts for, you know, a lot of the language groups, like if you think about Indo-European, this yellow one, essentially being very dominant throughout much of the globe in terms of the spread of the language, especially being a very dominant language everywhere, or language family everywhere. You know, what would be the accounting purposes for that? At the same time, you know, we have Mandarin in with the, or not Mandarin itself, but the Sino-Tibetan, which Mandarin is a part of, all throughout here, and yet you have essentially Japanese and Korean, which are completely isolated, despite the fact that they are geographically close to China. And that's one thing to consider is why? Why do we have these differences? What causes them? And a lot of it comes back again to physical geography. All right. Obviously, there is, you know, seas separating Japan and Korea, but also Japan and China. Okay, there is a big mountain range that separates China and North Korea, or the Korean Peninsula. Just like we have the Sahara Desert limiting right here, the Congo down here, and over here you have the Amazon. Really, really cold temperatures up here. So there are reasons for why the language families develop in many cases where they do. All right, and then others, you know, obviously through travel and colonization. So Australia, New Zealand, you know, South Africa, obviously help play a role with that. Same thing with, you know, Indo-European being here in the Americas with, you know, English and Spanish. All right. So where you see major language families as a percentage of speakers of the world, Indo-European languages, okay, again, that's German, English, French, Dutch, Spanish, account for about 50% of the world's speakers. All right. Sino-Tibetan, which includes Mandarin, 24%, and then, you know, these other groups, you know, much more smaller ones. All right. So then you break it up based on, you know, actual language. You can kind of see that broken up here. So English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And then you get the more indigenous languages, including Maya up here. Again, you can kind of see that. And then, you know, over here, you don't get to see the table, but it is also represented in these areas as well. So yeah, they can kind of see where all the specific languages are predominantly spoken, which I think is really, really cool. And again, the book has similar things. So some terms, this kind of plays in a little bit later in the actual chapter. We're going to mention them here, just to kind of be aware of. So an official language is a language adopted for use by the government for the conduct of business and publication of documents. So things like passports, you know, road signs, you know, stop signs are like that, driver's licenses, money. While a standard language is sustained by the government in the form of business, education, and mass communication, but it's not actually official. Like in the United States, we don't have an official language. We have a standard language, and that is English. We don't actually have an official, national, official language. All right, we have a standard English language that we use for government business, and you know, at one point there was talk about turning that to German. That and that was during the American Revolution, which, you know, obviously didn't pan out. So just because every country has an official or standard language does not mean that everyone speaks it, because we know that there are people that do not necessarily speak English or want to speak English in the United States. Canada has, predominantly English speakers, except for Quebec, where, we talked with the French Canadians. China, Mandarin is the big one, but there are other languages within China, Mandarin being the biggest one. Nigeria, as we'll come back to later in this chapter, has so many languages. And so, yeah, many of them have a standard or an official language for convenience or as a result of colonialism. Again, something we're going to play back in later. And then we have down here, logograms is a symbol that represents a word rather than a sound. All right. So the example, and I'll pull my screen here. I don't know if that actually does anything in the recording, but down here you have the Chinese symbol for tiger. Okay. And that is the symbol rather than the actual sound of the word, the vowel being the sound of tiger in Chinese. And I don't know what, or Mandarin, I don't know exactly what actually the word is, how it's pronounced. But then I also threw up Hebrew up here because while you have letters like you do in a regular language like English, the vowels are added in at a different time. So it's a different kind of logogram in the sense that the vowels are the sounds. But if you took out, the vowels that are listed here, E, I, O, and I, because the word here is Elohim, that is a Hebrew word for God. And then the consonants are actually up here, but the vowels in Hebrew doesn't actually have letters for E, O, and I, or even A and Y and U. All right, those are all kind of written out in a sense with these vowels that are placed up here. All right, so those get added to other words. So it's a kind of interesting way to look at it. Some other definitions here: a monolingual state is a country which only one language or one official language is spoken. All right, a multilingual state is a country that uses more than one official language. So India is kind of an example of that. You can kind of see the various different language families as a result of that. But yeah, and then you got other multilingual states like the United States is like that, but we have again that one standard language. Other countries, as we'll see, have a lot of different stuff with it too, as we'll again play in later on throughout the unit. All right, India adopted English as an official language along with Hindi. All right, and then there are 22 other languages that they recognize because of the different ethnic groups and languages that are spoken throughout all of India, because India has been kind of this gathering place of different cultures and groups because of access to trade. It's a central location within Asia. And so they have all of these different ones, Hindi is being spoken by the majority of the people, as well as English because of the colonial thing of being a British colony, and then recognizing those other ethnic groups. Vocab can reveal a cultural hearth because of where we see similar words being used or similar backgrounds. So that's kind of where we see the divergence is terming within that. So then we get the visuals, like again, if you want a more breakdown of where the world language families are, you can kind of see Indo-European here, okay, in the purple, obviously. The Sino-Tibetan, Kosian, kind of in southeastern, or I guess it'd be southwestern Africa, Niger-Congo, which is more of the Bantu-speaking peoples, Nilo-Saharan, okay, so that plays a little bit within Kenya, within the Sudan, within Chad, Afro-Asiatic, so that is predominantly Arabic. And then, yeah, so that's where we're going to finish up with this first one. Hopefully, you get a better understanding of the definitions of language and how language trees work and why we actually use those to kind of help to associate connected or similar languages and kind of, the other definitions about those. And we'll expand upon some of these ideas as we go forward.